Well, I usually have some form of top executives, and he or she rings me and says, "Oh, I want my people to behave differently." They should change, right? And my first question is usually, well, how are you going to change?
What are your inner thermometers to actually notice, oops, I fell below the line?
I'm not thinking about them, I'm thinking about myself. So the most important tool in any of my conversations is my own mindset. And we talked about humility and about gratefulness.
How do you prepare yourself today?
It's very simple. So you can join me actually if you want to.
I'll make it as a coach, light the spark inside, empower every soul to turn the tide. I'll make it as a coach, help others grow, changing lives with every story I know.
How do you facilitate change in a huge organization? Why do transformations fail even though the smartest consultants have worked out the strategy? My guest today says because change does not start with structures, it starts with the leader's willingness to look at themselves. Nils Cornelissen spent a decade at McKinsey & Company before founding his own consultancy, Return on Meaning. Today, he works with top executives in large corporations who navigate restructuring and the pressure to perform. So we talk about why leaders often want others to change first and why treating employees like adults is surprisingly difficult. But we don't only leave it at philosophy, but make it super practical. How does Niels help leaders to change their attitude with tiny questions? How does he prepare himself before going into difficult coaching conversations? These are themes I've read and talked about before, but rarely have I heard so actionable advice that also helps super cognitive people like me to stay aware of my personal state in a difficult conversation. So let's get started. Let's meet Niels. What mission are you on in your life?
A very interesting question. I used to say I'm here to make people happy. My purpose is to make people happy. And as Toby, but maybe not our listeners, I used to work for McKinsey for 20 years. And I often said to people, I joined McKinsey because I want to make people happy. And people often had a question mark in their face. But it sounds a bit banal, right? Making people happy. So it's not a superficial, hedonistic type of happiness, but it's more, at the moment, I'm a lot working on helping leaders or executives to become more honest with themselves and with the surroundings. And I think that creates closeness and proximity and intimacy, and that creates psychological safety, and that enables then better performance in the end.
So when you say happy, you don't think of pleasure, but more of meaning and a purposeful work life. It sounds like
Exactly. So it's very much in the direction of purpose. You know, there's this book called Flourish on positive psychology, and that's also, so there is elements of flow in there, there's elements of meaning and purpose in there, there's peace, inner peace, right? It's contentment is also part of it. It's not necessarily the ecstatic enthusiasm, so it can be a very silent happiness as well.
Mhm. Mhm. And that also reflects not only in your personal mission statement, but even in the name of the company that you co-created and lead, which is Return on Meaning. In order to dive a bit into what you are doing at Return on Meaning, I would like to ask you, what is a typical client of yours and what challenge do you usually help them with?
Yes. So we work a lot for the big corporate companies in Germany. So I think in the last 25 years as a consultant and coach and trainer, I've worked for half of all DAX companies. And big corporates can be in any type of industry. So currently automotive supplier, pharma company, one of our big mobility companies in Germany. There's only two. We work for both big trade companies. But increasingly, there's also startups that have grown big, e-commerce or fintech companies. There's also a unicorn as part of our client list. And of course, there's also public organizations that are interested in some form of change. And basically, you also ask, what is the work I'm doing? Usually people come to me because they're in some form of transformation or transition. They have a new strategy. It used to be becoming more agile or achieving new sales targets. In the last year, it has also been a lot of restructuring, downsizing, thinking differently how to deal with all the risks and dangers and insecurities that are out there in the world. All of these can be content business challenges. And then my job, or the job of return on meaning, is to take the people on board, basically. To just give you an example, there was this automotive supplier we worked with last year. They needed to restructure. There was the Boston Consulting Group was in there as a big consulting firm. They did all the restructuring. They've been there with 35 consultants. And our job was to take the people along. So we asked the top team to get together. We did have some form of team coaching, I would say, with this top team, where it was a lot about how they interact with each other, but also with others in the organization. How can they drive the change for 25,000 people? It was. But we also work with the 25,000 people out there. We often form some type of in the organization that sort of complements a top-down drive or change from the top with some bottom-up that's in there.
Super interesting. And I think maybe with today's episode, we can gradually zoom in on how this works. So to get us started, can you describe a bit more how the beginning of such a journey looks like? If this was a one-on-one coaching conversation, we often say you do a contracting in the beginning of the journey, right? Like finding out what is the issue that we want to work on. How does that usually look like in your world?
Well, I usually have some form of top executives, and he or she rings me and says, oh, I want my people to behave differently. They should change, right? And my first question is usually, well, how are you going to change? And usually the answer is something like, I sort of thought it's more about the other people in my organization. Then I'm asking again, well, how are you prepared to change your own demeanor? Because if you think you're doing everything right, this will trickle down in the organization. So if you think you do this, then the middle management will do the same. And then in the end, shop floor employees that feel the need to change. So it has to start from the top. And that is already starting some kind of personal journey, even though it's been about the organization and about the organizational change that you talked about. There's always, in addition to the whole broad organizational change, there's always some form of team or group dynamics on different levels. And there is the individual perspective with the top executives who are leading it. And often it's creating these aha moments. Well, it's actually, I have to change as well. Otherwise, this will never be successful.
And what kind of change are we talking about? Because I guess first thing that people would answer is there is some sort of business need to change. So I don't know, let's say we are at big car company and there's now the electric mobility revolution happening and we need to do some catching up. But I have all these engineers that really like engines. I guess it's that sort of world. But it sounds like you are talking more on a shift of mindset that then starts at the top. It seemed like you want the leadership to be humble in a way.
Yes.
Or how exactly would you describe it?
Humility is definitely a helpful attribute if you want to lead and if you want to lead change or transformation. And I think the example you gave is actually quite accurate. So there is usually a business need, an outer change, right? Electrifying cars, a different strategy, restructuring, downsizing, innovation, right? We work for a pharma company and it took them 6 years to develop a new drug. And they wanted to size it down to 3 years in total. So these are all different kind of business needs. And there is a content perspective, right? So for example, and there they usually have content consultants. Like as in the example before, there was Boston Consulting Group, or they do it themselves internally, or you have a consulting firm that talks about innovation. And all of these content-driven people, or the engineers, right? They always think it's more structural issue. And as I mentioned earlier, I've worked for almost for 10 years for McKinsey and Company as a consultant. I realized to make change happen, you need a solid business case, you need a thorough analysis, you need the right technical or content solutions, definitely. But that wasn't the reason why change efforts or transformations failed. Why transformations fail was in 2/3 of the cases was, well, the people weren't getting on board. There was a gap between the top executive board. They said, oh, we need to change, but the employees didn't want it. And I think every business problem has both a content side and the people or change side. So what is this content, this change side? Or the people or change side. It's the psychological dimensions of all the people involved. It's the group dynamics, etc. And we are always looking at this perspective, or with this perspective, we are looking at the change or the transformation. But usually the reason why we change in the first place, that is a business need. And people tell us often, our clients tell us, we are the ones who bridge the business and this people perspective on problems they have.
So bringing the human side, the kind of mindset shift into the leadership team for it to trickle down. How do you diagnose what's the issue? Like how do you find out what tool to unpack from your toolbox?
A very good question, and one I'm often being asked. And why I find this question so fascinating is I would say I don't need to understand what the problem is. What do I mean by that? The classical idea of consultants when I was working for McKinsey, right? The client has a problem. McKinsey thinks through the solution and then offers the solution to the client. But when I talk about this, right, you already hear a potential implementation gap that might come up. I don't know how you feel about it, but if somebody comes up to me with a great idea that I was never involved in, at Return on Meaning, we are 25 people by now. And I founded it together with my friend and colleague, Svea. And there's now 3 partners in our company. And even though I talk a lot about change and innovation and so forth, right? If one of my employees comes up to me and wants to change our whole business, I'm first being defensive, right? I wasn't involved. Where does this come from, etc.? These are all kinds of thoughts. And I think it's very normal, right? And so it's a not invented here syndrome. One of the ways of how we think about change is that not somebody comes with a problem and we solve it for them. But it's like in a good coaching. It's not the coach doesn't solve the problem, but the coach helps the client solve the problem themselves. And in a similar way, you can think about organizational development or the organizational frame, right? So I see my role less of me solving the problem. I would say I'm co-responsible for that the problem is being solved. So I'm not completely systemic and I say it's not my thing and I just let them happen. So the real world is I do have a stake in getting it solved. And yet it's not me who is solving it, but I'm creating a space where the client can solve their issues themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me a lot of that small hack that I learned in my early trainer education. When imagine a semicircle of people and one of them asks, okay, and how do I now approach XYZ, this challenge in public speaking? And the first answer that you give is not an answer, but it is asking back, what do you think? And rolling the ball back in their field so they can come up with their own solution. And what I hear for you, it's a lot about the ownership. You want the idea to be owned by them.
Exactly. And what I liked about this tool, and if I think about our listeners, so one of the tools is actually helping executives, also not them solving the issues for their employees, but them giving the responsibility back to their employees by asking, what have you already tried? Uh-huh. I'm hearing an interesting question. You are asking me how we could solve X, Y, and Z. What have you already tried? Who have you talked to? What are you going to do to get it solved? If you think about these three questions, right, it leaves the responsibility with the employees. So many of my executives I'm supporting, they always say, how do I get my people empowered? How do I get my people empowered? If their employees ask them a question, they provide a solution. That's the best way to disempower your employees. So one way to empower your employees is to take them seriously. It's interesting, right? They don't take them seriously. They don't really treat them as adults. Treating them as adults would be if the employees come up and say, how would you solve this problem? Would you do A or B? I would recommend most executives in most cases not to give the simple answer, but simply ask the question, what have you already tried? Who did you already talk to? What would you need to get it solved? And what would you need from me first? And if you do this, you empower your own employees and they will show more ownership. So very little, sometimes in coaching, I find this fascinating. I don't know how you feel about it, Toby, but sometimes it's this little question that makes a big difference.
Yeah, the coach in me thinks this is amazing and yet obvious. And the leader in me thinks, oh, fuck, guilty. So I think it's a big leap from theory to practice. And that's maybe also what I would like to dig a bit deeper, because if you ask this question, let's say you have this executive who says they don't take ownership. You ask them, okay, what have you tried already? How do you make that stick in particular? So do you have a certain intervention that really anchors that not only on a cognitive level where they say, yeah, okay, you have a point there, but actually leads to this behavior change?
There's lots of steps involved, right? And and what I find so amazing, I don't know how you feel about it, but we talked about humility early on. The longer I do the job I'm doing, the more I just feel grateful for being in the position of being asked for help and being able to help other people and even earning a living with it and running a company with it. And I'm also getting much more in awe of how we tick. I don't know, Toby, what would I need to, it's January when we have this conversation. And I don't know, did you have a new year? Did you have any good intentions for the new year?
Yeah, so I have partnered with a good friend and we set up this habit tracker app and set out to, we committed to making time 1 hour every day to work on our thing. And our thing is not urgent, important project that we always say we want to do and don't get to. In my case, because it's, work days are just full and there's emails and there's podcast episodes with deadlines and so on and meetings and this sort of stuff where you really need to sit down, block out some time. That rarely happens. And then I always thought, okay, I need to make 4 hours time for that. But 4 hours don't happen,
Exactly.
especially with a baby now. So I said, okay, let me just trickle that down to 1 hour. And that's my New Year's resolution. So long answer to a simple question.
To cut down what you just said, I'm talking to an expert, right? Because what you did is from the big challenge, you put it into smaller steps, right? It's the 1% challenge, right? Is one of the books, etc. Atomic Habits is another one, right? It's making it into small habits. The other bit, what you did is you partnered up with somebody else. Very good. Peer pressure works a lot. You have some form of vision or positive example. So if you wanted to do more sports, right? It's in addition to just wanting to do more sports, maybe you want to sign up for a marathon in a year's time or something, right? Having this vision is also, so there's all these things that help us to keep good intentions longer. But in the end, if people ask me, what would I need to do more sports, right? I can do all of the stuff out there. But what would I really need to do? I would need to simply do it, act, right? And it's a priority. It's simply, I wouldn't need a lot of advice on how I do more sports. If I look at companies or at executives, and if they want their employees to work differently or change, they often explain how people have to act to achieve a certain goal. So For example, the issue of empowerment or taking ownership, right? Very often I find that executives explain their employees how they have to create more ownership. The thing is, if I talk to the employees, they know what they would need to be doing. They know everything. It's a priority issue. It's not an issue of how you do it. But that is very typical. Executives treat, again, the employees as if they were children, as if they had to explain to them what they need to do. No. What the employees have, right, they often have ambiguous goals, right? There is my boss who says you have to work harder on X, but there's also all the other tasks that I have. And people don't know how to prioritize. And sometimes it leads to stillstand, right? And then if you do this for a long time, you get to burnout eventually. So the question that you're asking is how, for an employee, if an executive talks to their employees, the idea is how can I create a joint vision and prioritize correctly, and then maybe create a support network of other people, of peers, to help you do it. That would be a way of how you get people into action.
Can we make that even more practically?
Sure.
Like, how many people are involved? What is the group dynamics? If you take us into this boardroom where these things are discussed.
So, as I said, there's 3 different levels, right? There is the organizational level where we work with these ambassadors. There is the individual level where I have one-on-one conversations, coachings with individual leaders. And there is this team dynamic. Let's say a boardroom, right? I'm working with the top team in an organization, the executive board, the CXOs of an organization or of a certain business division, and I have them in the group. And of course, normally, if I do something like this, I try to build rapport beforehand with every individual. So how do I do that? I have one-on-one conversations with each of them. And I'm trying to understand what drives them, right? How, not only the content of this team, so who joined when and who do you like and what do you like about others and what do you appreciate about them, what could they be doing better, etc. I'm also trying to understand where do they stand emotionally and where do they stand towards such a process, because usually it's not a one-off, but usually I'm working with teams over time, and so I need to get the buy-in of the individuals, and they're particularly the most skeptical participants. It's often the CFO.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I ask you what are the things that keep you busy in our prep talk, you said team coaching. And what I hear now is that one of your first steps in such a team coaching process is actually to meet people one-on-one, to build this rapport, to make sure that the chemistry between you and each member of the team is there and that there's a certain openness to you as a process facilitator, I guess.
Yes, exactly. And Toby, you asked earlier, how do we make it concrete? So to become even more concrete, and I'm trying to make things, I'm oversimplifying things here, but what do I do for this conversation? So the first thing is I'm not thinking about them, I'm thinking about myself. So the most important tool in any of my conversations is my own mindset. And we talked about humility and about gratefulness. And I'm doing some mental training, and there's different forms, and we can talk about what this is. But I'm doing some form of mental training to prepare myself so that I'm entering that conversation in a very creative mindset. With creative, I don't mean creative in the sense of having lots of ideas. That usually also happens here. But with creative, I mean not being reactive, not being very curious about what's going to happen. Even though if the other person says, oh, you suck, or I had clients in my first conversations, thanks for being here, but but let's get straight. I don't want you being here. So of course you can imagine what we do. So it's working on myself. So in my whole education, at the beginning when I participated in my first coaching classes or training classes or constellation work, I was very much looking for the right tool or for the right questions or so forth. And more I realized whether I'm prepared to actually ask the right question has more to do with my own fears, my own angst, my own shame, right? And so I started working more on my psychological dimensions so that I'm not as triggered as I might be if somebody tells me, oh, that sucks, or you suck, or I don't want you here, because it's nothing anybody would want to hear, I guess.
So I guess this inner work that you're describing, that has been a long process, and I'll ask you about that in a bit. But to stay on the topic of concrete actions, how does this inner preparation look like for you before going into this boardroom where conversations might get difficult, where you will receive resistance possibly? How do you prepare yourself today?
It's very simple. So you can join me actually if you want to. Are you sitting on a chair or are you standing, Toby?
I'm
Okay.
standing.
So if everybody of the listeners, you can also join us. So you can stand simply on your 2 feet, feel your feet. If you're sitting, stay seated. It's also fine. Then you can also feel your bum on the chair. Straighten up a bit. Yeah, I'm actually I'm making a sound. Breathe out with this big sigh. It relaxes everybody. Everybody knows it, but it's amazing, right? If I enter the first class in a train, or if I enter the business class in a plane, right? There's so many people who are so tense and tied up and have a red face, right? I always want to shake them up and tell them, just sigh once, really sigh. Oh, it helps, right? Do you feel a bit more relaxed? It works, right? We all know it. It's almost banal, but we so often don't do it. We hold on to, we cramp up. So try to relax. Let your shoulders fall down a bit more. And then I'm thinking about what am I grateful for? And this can be very different for different people. So for me, it's my 10-year-old daughter, and I'm imagining a moment with her. It's also grateful for being now with this client. And then building some form of connection with this client and saying, if I expect a difficult conversation, that is, why could the world be difficult for this person? So I'm trying to come up with empathy for the situation of the other person. I'm not doing this if I'm having a fun conversation anyhow, right? Like this, before this conversation, Tobias, I didn't think about, oh, what would be a difficult. But there are sometimes these conversations or coachings where this client is in a difficult, or maybe towards me in a hostile position because he or she didn't, it was their boss who told them to come to me or so. So in those instances, I feel empathy for the other person. I'm trying to take the perspective of the other person and not only feeling with it, how does it feel, but I'm thinking about why would it make sense to feel that way? Why would it make sense to feel angry in this situation? Why would it make sense to feel helpless in this situation? And all of this creates empathy. And then I'm breathing in and out, stretching my arms, sighing again, and that's it. It sounds simple, right? But it's a simple centering exercise, getting into humility, gratefulness, and into empathy and connection.
Yeah. And getting into your body. Like that, I think, is also what
Exactly.
the sighing, becoming aware of your stance does.
Exactly.
I love that, especially in that combination. Like I heard the individual parts before, but especially with this like very proactive empathy exercise, it reminds me even a bit of meta meditation, like this kind of meditation where you wish well-being to the other and to all beings in a way that brings you in this very open, above the line kind of mindset.
It is inspired indeed by meta meditation. In my 20s, I did twice a 10-day meditation retreat with 2 great teachers, Australian by background, Rosemary and Steve Wiseman. And they do Vipassana meditation and compassion felt meditation. And it's similar to what is also called meta meditation. So it's wishing other people well, basically, that's it. And of course, it helps that I've done it for days, for 10 hours a day. It helps me now to get quicker into that state. I think if you're doing it for the first time, it might take a bit of practice to get directly into a different state.
Yeah. So in a way, you've been going to the mental gym by meditating I don't know, every morning or at whatever regularly to sort of ground the state, anchor the state, and now you can turn it on with this small micro exercise.
Yes, and I had phases in my life where I didn't meditate at all, where I drank too much wine, where I slept too little, and so forth. So I'm a bit skeptical about this always self-improvement hype. I've read some piece of research that says people who read self-help books, they are more unhappy than people who don't read them, because they read what they could be doing, and then we feel even more pressure to perform, and then it gets even more ambitious and more. So I'm a friend of sighing and of humility and humanism. And that's also something many of the executives I'm working with, they're very controlled. They're very disciplined. They're very hardworking and they are very controlling. And often part of my process with them is stepping out of this cage, right? Because it's great. It's great that they have this. It's appreciating what they have and where it brought them, but at the same time not trying so much to hold on and be always in control. Because I think their happiness and their ability to lead increases with them letting go. There's other people, right, who find it difficult to motivate themselves to do sports or to have a structure, right? For them, it's great to be disciplined and to have a plan and all of this. But I think people are very different. And most of my clients, they're very hardworking. For them, it's rather they neglect the family. I just recently had a very expensive coaching, and the outcome for the coachee was that he goes to a flower shop, buys the biggest bunch of flowers and tells his wife that he loves her. Sometimes it can be simple things like that that they lose sight of.
Yeah. So it's also this act of letting go and holding things more lightly that actually help the leaders get into this state that you just described. You want to get in when you talk
Exactly.
with them. And in a way, for this to trickle down and spark this cultural change, basically what the leaders need to do is to I don't want to say model you, but yeah, model you in that regard, at least, to then actually empower their team members.
And one of the exercises I often do in these team coachings is simply a reflection on which state I am in. So, as I just called them, I can talk about a creative state or a reactive state. And creative is curious, is open, is feeling I am in control of life, right? I'm feeling energetic usually, I'm feeling being in flow, etc. And reactive is sometimes we call this triggered. Well, it's not a real trigger, it's not a trauma, right? Where the term trigger originally comes from, but it's like feeling it can be a little bit of a amygdala hijack, right? It can be, sometimes it can be angry or feeling fear or wanting to run away or feeling frustrated or all of this. And simply for me, life is simply I'm either in that one or in the other state. And for any type of leadership, I think it's important to be in this state of creativeness. But the issue is we often don't notice it if we are in the other bit. I just recently had a leader was standing there, I'm not in a reactive mode. And it can happen to me as well. I remember situations where I told my wife, no, I'm all fine. And if we are all honest to ourselves, we all know these situations where we are the last ones in the room to notice that we are in a reactive mode. And I'm not saying you can't become angry, right? Being angry, even feeling rage, is simply an emotion. That's not bad or positive. So, for example, for me, I was very harmonious driven in my upbringing. And I had to get into the creative mode to allow myself to become loud. So that's also being creative, right? At the moment, I'm not triggered. I'm being loud myself. So it doesn't mean creative doesn't mean nice. In a creative manner, I can also hold up clearly my boundaries. Toby, you know that we've written this book, Culture Change in Organizations, and there is a big chapter on this whole reactive and creative. There's also a great video. There it's called Above and Below the Line leadership, and we can put it in the show notes. And it's being the Arbinger Institute. They have written a book about being in the box and out of the box. So there's lots of these frameworks. They're all similar to each other. But it's simply, am I curious at a certain moment? Am I grateful? Or am I in an ego thing, whether either making myself too big, like an American president somewhere, or making myself too small and thinking it's my fault and I don't never get it done. It's both reactive. And having people reflect on their own stances and on situations where they are triggered or where their hot button or red button is pushed, right? This is how also we sometimes call it. It opens people up. It creates, nobody is perfect. So I'm also saying we are all in this reactive mode. We are in there dozens of times a day. And it's not about, no, I'm never getting into this. It's rather becoming more fluid and becoming more imperfect by saying, oh, well, yes, I get into it. And it's more about recognizing sooner if I'm in to get out of it sooner. And if we have this conversation between the executives in a team, we create psychological safety, and that enables more openness and honesty. And that, in the end, creates hopefully also better performance in the team.
I'd like to ask you one more question about this reactive versus creative state, or above the line versus below the line state. You mentioned you're also getting into this state below the line regularly still.
Yes.
How do you notice? Like, what are your inner thermometers to actually notice, oops, I fell below the line? How can I pull myself out? Like, how do you manage this yourself?
So one of the things is, if I'm thinking, oh, this time I'm right and you're wrong, it's very likely that I'm in a reactive stance. If I'm thinking, do I have to hold this project or this company or this whatever together and everybody else is, am I only surrounded by idiots? Most likely I'm in a reactive mode. If I'm thinking I'm the one to blame for everything here, oh, I did something so wrong, I'm probably in a reactive state. But it's a very good question. So with one executive, I actually agreed he's measuring his pulse in a meeting when he feels, oh, could I be? And he's counting his pulse. He's a doctor and he's counting his own pulse. And so it worked for him. I wouldn't even know how to count my own pulse, but he did. And he counts. And if it went beyond, I don't remember what exactly, then he thinks, okay, it's time to call it a separator or to have a break and to get out of this situation. So there's one more thing I want to tell you. For me, it's a fundamental aspect to all of life, whether it's business life or private life or happiness in life. It is this reactive versus creative. I think any meditation, any enlightenment intensive, any psychological therapy is basically about this in the end. What struck me was when I started thinking and reflecting on this, I first noticed I get into the reactive mode more often than before. And I thought, hello, what the hell is going on? I'm working on myself, I'm meditating. Why am I getting more into it? And the reason being simply, I got more sensitive to my own inner state. Because in fact, any situation, it happens to, now I'm noticing it happens to me a dozen times. If you stop smiling, if you look away, I'm thinking, oh, am I getting too boring? That's a little oomph, that's a little reactive. And it's these little things, noticing them and being honest to myself and to others, yes, it happens. I'm not perfect. I've got shame, I've got fear, I've got all these unpleasant emotions and feelings, and that's fine, that's okay. But many of the executives I'm working with, as I said earlier, right, they can be very controlling sometimes. They find it very difficult to admit that they are not perfect and that they're not, that they're getting into this reactive state that is not so great, etc. So for them, it's opening up to this idea that, yeah, I am not, there is something happening inside me that is not great. And I'm still okay. But that was a big learning for me. It took me a couple of years to actually get into this acceptance of, yes, I'm judgmental about other people. I'm judgmental about myself. And I think we all are, actually. But it takes a while to accept that, truly accept it.
Yeah, this really resonates. In fact, I can even also relate it to my meditation retreat experience, where I was also coming out of the experience and noticing, wow, I'm so annoyed constantly. How can that be? Like, I'm coming out of the experience and I'm supposed to be relaxed, no? But I was also constantly annoyed. And then at some point realizing, wow, this is probably because I'm just feeling it more in my body. And it also stopped. And that was not because I became more Zen, but simply because this sensitivity faded away. And now I also find it very difficult. And this is also what I love about your answer, because when I asked you, how do you notice? What is your inner thermometer? I expected you to say, watch out for your body when you tighten in your chest, etc. Which, sure, I get it. But it's so difficult, especially when I'm below the line, to feel my body. And so I love that you have a trigger that is more of a cognitive trigger, that like the alarm bell is not your chest tightens, but the alarm bell is watch out. Are you believing all the other people are idiots? Or watch out. Are you believing I am right and you are wrong? So that's the alarm bell, not your chest. So this seems super actionable to me.
Very many of the executives I'm working with, they're very cognitive, right? They're very smart people. And so for them, it's easier to look out for mental models or for mental sentences. Am I only surrounded by idiots? This time I'm really right, etc. And therefore I'm using this. But of course, you can also use the body. To get out of the reactive state, there I think the body is easier than mental models. Of course, I can think about mental models like what am I grateful for is a mental model, right? Or thinking about my 10-year-old daughter, as I said earlier on, in this little exercise we did together. But there, the first thing is the body. And that I actually learned from Tony Robbins. I find Tony Robbins very strange. I was once at one of his seminars and he said his biggest value is love, even though this was all about performance, right? If you think in spiral dynamics, these different value systems, there is the orange value system, which is performance. And this was so orange. Tony Robbins is just orange. He's so 80s and so orange. And he claims that his biggest value is love. Either he's lying to himself and to others, which is not very nice, or he is simply wrong, which is also not very nice. So I can't take him very seriously. But of course, he has a lot of competence as a trainer and as a coach, right? At the seminar, one of the things that he said he was telling about this person who was in a very depressive mode. And he said the first thing he said is sit up straight. Because that's the easiest way to change our mind. And so sitting up straight or loosening up or raising your arm, sighing, right? These are all bodily functions and they help us a lot to get into a different mindset as well.
Even a nice image when I hear the I am right, you are wrong alarm bell sounding, imagining the massive Tony Robbins in front of me and sit up and take a sigh. That's a nice one. Okay, wow. What is the change that you would love to see in the culture, the mindset, the attitudes of people in these rooms? And what is it that you have already started doing about it?
Yes. There's two dimensions, right? There's something I would like to see out there, and I'll tell you a little bit about it in a second. And there's something I think that I would like more executives to focus on. So one of them is I would like every executive out there to really take how they think and feel as seriously as their technical competence in their job. And these type of future skills, it's my psychological dimension, psychosocial dimension. These are the future skills of people. Emotional intelligence is a concept of Daniel Goleman, and you can train it, you can learn it. Even we've put up this program. You don't have to take hours. There's other ways of learning it. But we formed this program. It's called Momentum. It's for 7 weeks. And for 7 weeks, you meet with a small cohort of 12 people. You reflect on how you think and how you feel about certain things. And then you get a 10-minute audio podcast kind of meditation every day with an app of yourself. And you can train how you think, how you view the world, how you feel about others, how you feel about your connection. And it's fascinating. And I would love, and luckily nowadays people do it, even in Davos, right? Nowadays in Davos at the World Economic Forum, you can meditate every day at several locations. It has become more normal for executives to think about the way how they feel and think. But if you haven't done so, I think it's time to start for any executive and learn that. And one way would be momentum. Maybe we can also put it in the show notes to have a bit of advertising, but there's also other ways, but that's a way of doing it. And what would be my sort of view or vision for the boardroom out there? I would love it to be also, I think we've learned to create vulnerability. And I think, so for example, in the workshops that I'm doing and team coaching I'm doing, it can happen that individuals cry, right? And at least they feel very touched and they open up. And I think that's something that is happening, and it will happen even more so. Ideally, executives would learn not only to do it in the workshop with me or with other facilitators, but also in their boardroom at home. But we have one client, a big German mobility company, and there they actually do this. They spend 45 minutes on an intensive check-in before they start their full day boardroom session. And they talk about everything that's on their mind, and even the thing that they don't like or that they find challenging. And I think that's a big start. I don't think they're there yet that they would share what they are really angry about or that they could hold each other's anger. I think that's the next level. I think society will need 10 more years to actually acknowledge also anger in such a way as vulnerability. But I think we are on a good track of getting there.
Wow. So bringing vulnerability, bringing humility to the boardrooms.
And that's it for today. And I know it's quite a cliffhanger ending for this episode. And when I started the conversation, I also thought we'd go right into the facilitation and team coaching methods of Nils. However, I found his ideas on staying above the line so valuable that I simply had to dig deeper there. So if you found this approach to mindfulness and self-management valuable, and you happen to be employed at an organization, you might also want to check out what Nils and his colleagues developed in that regard. They have built the Momentum program, a 12-week group coaching journey towards more emotional intelligence and resilience. You can find that on mymomentum.life. And of course, I was also curious to learn more about what happens after Nils has prepared himself and once he steps into the boardroom or the executive offsite space. This is a conversation we will have here again in 2 weeks on our next episode. What does Nils' approach to the conversation itself look like, and what feedback facilitation methods is he using? So tune in again for the Impactful Coach in 2 weeks from today. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. I'm Toby, co-founder of MetaFox Coaching Tools, and I wish you impactful coaching conversations ahead. See you back here again in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.